Who are the sponsors for solutions?
Pardon me?
Who are the sponsors for solutions?
I have to look it up.
Good afternoon and welcome. I see that folks are joining us. We'll give folks just another minute to join the session. See that a few more folks are coming in. Get started in just a moment. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the final session of NHC's annual policy convening, Tech and Housing Symposium. I'm Christa Vinson, Program Officer at Rural LISC, and I lead our broadband and infrastructure pillar. It's a great honor to be here today at the invitation of NHC and with this distinguished panel. Thank you, David and Brittany. We're wrapping up today's event with a discussion on expanding broadband access and digital opportunity and its intersection with affordable housing. Home is where we literally connect and are rooted. And increasingly, those connections have necessarily become virtual, connecting us to health, to education, to work, and to social supports. But how to make connectivity work better for all? That's the purpose of today's discussion. This panel will explore the relevant connections between housing policy and broadband access as a tool for community development and economic resiliency. They'll draw on their varied backgrounds to explore this intersection and these key questions. So I'd love to now briefly introduce our panel. Today we're joined by Riordan Frost, a research analyst at the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies, who works on projects related to demographics, residential mobility, utilities, wealth inequality, and homelessness. Welcome, Riordan. We're joined by Myles Kamisher-Koch, a member of the broadband team at the Center on Rural Innovation, where he engages public and private stakeholders in the development of broadband solutions to serve rural communities across the country. Welcome, Myles. Paul Robinson recently formed Sepia Transformation Partners, which is a development firm focusing on housing authorities and RAD conversions with a special emphasis on resident and community transformation. Mr. Robinson has worked in the affordable housing arena for more than 23 years and has been involved in the financing and development of more than 24 low-income housing tax credit transactions. Welcome, Paul. Alan Fitzpatrick is co-founder and CEO of Open Broadband LLC, an internet service provider providing hybrid fiber and wireless broadband service to underserved communities. Alan has over 25 years of experience in telecommunications and co-founded the 501c3 nonprofit NC Broadband Matters, which promotes high-speed internet to residents across North Carolina. Welcome, Alan. And last but not least, Ziggy Rivkin-Fish, Vice President of Broadband Strategy at CTC Energy and Technology, where he specializes in project management and process planning. Since 2005, he has served as the lead manager for all phases of deployment of NCRNet, the interoperable public safety communications network in the National Capital Region around Washington, D.C. So as you can see, we have a large and very distinguished panel, and let's get right to it. We just have a little under an hour together. So Riordan, I'd love to start with you. Your research shows how the COVID pandemic amplified the digital divide. What are your findings around how folks are adopting broadband or face barriers in doing so as a result of the pandemic, and how can that help us situate our conversation today?
Right. So thank you very much, Christa, for moderating and for NHC for having me on this panel. I'm really interested in broadband internet and how the pandemic has really changed that, and started researching that at the Joint Center. And one of the things that I've been looking at, and I will share my screen to share just a couple of figures, is how much working from home has kind of changed, and how much, like broadband has really changed from being a luxury to a necessity. So this slide shows, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a kind of special current population survey, COVID-19 supplement that asked specifically about working from home. And before this, in 2019, based on the American Community Survey, the best estimate as to how many people work from home was about 5% of the workforce. So that went up to about almost 40% in May of 2020, which is when the survey started. And it's decreased to about 15% in terms of overall full-time workers, but that's still like 3 times higher, than it used to be. And so this kind of tells you 2 important points. One is that, don't necessarily believe that everybody everywhere is working from home, but 2, it's a huge increase as to who was working from home in the past and who is now. And it's also more than just this in terms of how much broadband is necessary, because it's not just that, this many people are working from home. It's also that other things are remote now. Sometimes school is remote. Sometimes telehealth, is remote. So there's so many things now that are going online that it's not just about, how quickly you can stream, entertainment or anything like that. It's about very necessary things, about like accessing government services, accessing medical care, and sometimes working from home as well. And so what I did is I looked at American Community Survey data for what people would report for whether they had high-speed internet or not. And now this does not say whether they have access, whether they don't have access because of cost or because of like not having the infrastructure there. This is just asking households, do you have high-speed internet? And what you see is this big digital divide in often more rural states and states also in the South and Midwest, especially in the South by like Mississippi, Arkansas. Over a quarter of households do not have high-speed internet. And one of the issues that we'll get into today in this panel is the data on this. So this is just self-reported from households on the state level. And then there's other maps like this one from the NTIA, which the Deputy Secretary mentioned in his opening keynote. And so there's this map that kind of shows, okay, here's some broadband availability. There's one from the FCC that has internet service provider reported data that's a little different. And then Broadband Now has it even more different. So it's not something that, I'm not going to get into each one of these maps, but I think that as there's more attention to this and more policy efforts directed towards this, one of the big challenges is data and is how we measure broadband and how we figure out who's served by it and who's not.
Thank you. That was a very helpful overview. And staying again at that high level, Myles, I wonder if you can help our audience understand the policy backdrop for telecommunications and high-speed internet or broadband specifically that informs what Riordan shares in the environment that some of these decisions will be made in.
Sure. Thanks, Christa. So I think it's really important as we examine this from a policy standpoint to talk about one of the very basic facts of broadband and high-speed internet, which is that it's not a utility. And even though we increasingly as a country, and especially with what Riordan was referring to and sort of spurred by the pandemic, view it as an absolute necessity, it's not a regulated utility. So the market is not required to go and provide it where it's not profitable. And I come at the work and the Center on Rural Innovation, hence the name, comes at the work with a focus on rural. And there's a pretty basic balance to keep in mind that there's a density issue at play. So the less dense an area becomes, the fewer households there are per mile, generally, the more expensive it is to deploy internet there. And because it's not a utility, once a tipping point is reached and it's extremely expensive to deploy, there is no regulation requiring that deployment to take place. So that's kind of a bedrock overview for sort of understanding a general lack of service that we're seeing. And then in sort of more current events, it's exciting that we're gathering now, and it's an exciting time to be in the space. because we're seeing an unprecedented level of funding become available to fill in those gaps. So at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, we're seeing dollars flowing like they've never really flowed before. And it's a time to be cautiously optimistic, not so much from a policy perspective, but sort of a nuts and bolts of the industry. The issue is compounded by the fact that what's considered to kind of be the gold standard of broadband infrastructure deployment is fiber and fiber-enabled technologies. Those also happen to be incredibly expensive to deploy. The capital required upfront is really high, and I should note that they're more scalable than other technologies, and the overall upkeep in the long term is lower. But you do have to overcome that upfront cost, and then there's an ROI associated with them that usually isn't what shareholders or companies with shareholders like to see. So it makes it difficult. It's a difficult environment, but we're seeing more dollars than we ever have, and more people are acknowledging the necessity. So again, I'll say cautious optimism around the general environment looking ahead.
Well, thank you. And I imagine that Paul can help us really see the upshot here. So Paul, can you take us down to the local level? I mean, if these dollars are flowing, how can developers start to ask questions about their opportunity to take advantage of this moment? HUD, for example, requires installation of broadband infrastructure at the time of new construction or substantial rehabilitation for multifamily rental housing that is funded or supported by HUD. So what questions are you asking as you lead rural housing development projects in the Southeast about kind of how to ask the question and take advantage of the opportunity?
Yep. Christa, first of all, I'd just like to thank you all for having me. I don't know how this happened. I just kept knocking on doors and stuff and trying to figure out how to employ broadband in some of the communities that we work in. And I ran into Christa, and Christa got me in touch with NHC. And I just want to thank NHC for having me, as well as the panelists, the other panelists. I've been working in rural areas for the last 12, 13 years in terms of doing affordable housing developments. And a new development took place when HUD initiated the RAD, HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And when that took place, it just opened my eyes to the possibility of really moving the needle in rural communities, because housing authorities are located there and they have the opportunity to move the needle when you're talking about 400 or 500 housing units with rental assistance demonstration. And so what I thought was extremely important for the panelists as well as the audience to understand is the context of RAD and how it works, so that then other people that are much smarter than me can help us plug in and connect the dots to see if we can get some broadband to these communities. So I'm going to share a screen real quick. I don't know if everyone can see the screen, but the thing that I'd like to kind of go over is really, this is really just a great opportunity, I think. I work in states of Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. And in Georgia and South Carolina, we now have federal credits and state credits. And so what I often say is the RAD program came about, and I just want to give the context in terms of the affordable housing industry. The first big act in the affordable housing industry was the Housing Act of 1937, which is basically building public housing across the country. The next act was the Act of 1965, which created HUD, which also monitors not only housing authorities, but issues affordable housing programs such as home and CDBG funds. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 came about, which merged the public and private entities in terms of providing affordable housing, the private money coming from banks and lenders, and the tax credits coming from the federal government. And then in 2012, HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration Program came about. And this is actually a merger of the low-income housing tax credit, private-public model, as well as the public housing authority model that is taking place. And I can just tell you, over the last couple of years, HUD has saved about $7 billion because of the RAD program, And so because of that, they've been able to do some very innovative things in terms of bumping up the rent structures on these developments that allows us to do more development when we go down in terms of either if it's going to be a rehabbing of the development or if we're going to build new construction. In the states of Georgia and South Carolina, because we have federal and state credits, we don't have a money problem. And so this is the first time that I can actually say that that's the case. And then the other thing is that we believe that this program is going to be permanent pretty soon. It's a demonstration program right now, but the success of it just lends us to believe that it's going to be a permanent program. But I just want to give the context to show you how powerful the HUD rental assistance demonstration program has become in the affordable housing industry. So what is RAD? RAD is basically a way of preserving affordable housing with public housing authorities. In the past, public housing authorities could not put debt on their program, on their properties. And so what RAD did was allow public housing authorities to partner with the experienced developers that utilize low-income housing tax credits and to remove the debt on and to lift the debt restrictions on the property and provide debt on the property so that you can do rehab and or new construction on these developments. So again, it's an extremely innovative program that has been established. And just to show you, in 2012, when the program came out, it was only 60,000 units available. In 2014, it jumped up to 185,000. I got into the business around 2013. And when I saw it jump up to 185,000, I said, there's no part of the government growing it by 3 times that amount. And then in 2017, it jumped up to 225. In 2018, it's 400 and almost 500,000. And again, we believe that it's going to be permanent. And there's 1.2 million public housing units across the country. So we don't say, at Sepia, we don't say RAD stands for rental assistance demonstration. We say it stands for Republicans and Democrats like it, which is very, very hard and beautiful place to be in the environment that we're in right now. What you see on the screen now is the ways that you can finance RAD deals. We're not concerned with anything to the left. We're not concerned with the public housing financing the deals or conventional loan with capital funds. What we're talking about is using low-income housing tax credits, either 4% or 9% tax credits. And you know, there's obvious reasons because you can do a lot more with it. So you'll see less funding on the left side, more funding on the right side. Primarily, large urban areas was able to use low-income housing tax credits through the Hope 6 program, Choice Neighborhood Initiative, in some cases, Section 18 Demo Dispo program. But that was really just limited to large metropolitan areas. You know, you've seen developments in New York City, Chicago, Atlanta, and places like that. But when RAD came around, it really just opened up kind of a Hope 6 model or choice neighborhood opportunities for rural communities. And so now rural housing authorities have the opportunity to participate with low-income housing tax credits, home and CDBG money. We've been able to use housing as a catalyst for individual and community transformation, because once you get that influx of money, $25 to $30 million on a development, all of a sudden the whole community gets energized about what can they do better to connect the community stakeholders, inclusion of community stakeholders, and then now finally to this conference is leveraging this investment in housing as a catalyst for broadband inclusion. And I am all ears to see how we can do that. But I just also wanted to put this out here just to give you the volume of housing authorities that are in the states that we work in, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, South Carolina. The number of housing authorities are at the top. For example, in Georgia, we have 176 housing authorities. Those housing authorities that have greater than 75 units, and all of these are medium and small. In this data right here, I took out all of the large housing authorities. So housing authorities like Atlanta, Augusta was taken out of this analysis. So you can see we've got 86 housing authorities in Georgia that would considered to be medium or small. And that's 16,000 units of housing. So you can see the data there. Really, it's an unlimited supply of housing authority opportunities that can, where RAD can be employed. And because we don't have when the 4% credit got locked, the combination of HUD investing in the rents and the 4% credit getting locked, it just allowed us to have, in some cases, excess money. I can tell you in some of the developments that I'm working in, I'm just gonna go to one of them real quick. In this development right here, which is in the LaGrange, city of LaGrange, the part in the white, we ended up doing $82,000 hard construction costs on those units. In some cases, all the 3 bedrooms, we extended them. They only had 1 bathroom, so we extended them to make sure that they had 2 bathrooms. But in the gray area, we're about to close on this deal within the next couple of months. We're spending $140,000 hard construction costs on per unit on this development. And it helps because you've heard about construction costs going up, but this is typically what takes place when you get 4% credit being locked in, as well as you're getting the innovation with rents now. HUD is allowing certain areas, if you're in an area of minority concentration, if you're in an opportunity zone, that you get extra rents on your development. And so this is just allowing for so much more excess cash to be employed in these developments. And we just believe that I think the time is right now for finding a way to include in the infrastructure numbers that we work on, and also in the building numbers that we work on, to include broadband as a possibility of including in all these RAD deals in small and rural areas. So I just wanted to say that that's the summary that I have, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else speak. Thank you, Krista.
Thank you for that, Paul. And so between Myles' cautious optimism and Paul's bullishness on innovation, why don't we break this down a little bit? And I'd love now to hear from Alan. You know, you're a broadband provider that's worked on a few projects that pair affordable housing developers, local public administrators, libraries, other anchor institutions to deliver broadband. There's more money sloshing around than there has been in the recent past. You know, Paul lifted up an example that folks maybe hadn't thought of. Tell us what made your projects work, and what would still be needed to scale such efforts?
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, by the way. So I represent an internet service provider. So we actually go into the low-income communities and put in broadband. So I was going to share some of the results and let you see some of the costs that we typically see and how it can be done. We do operate a lot in rural areas, by the way. So it's not just a metropolitan issue. And as Paul said, some of the housing communities can be quite small. We're currently working with an opportunity in Hot Springs, North Carolina, which is a town of about 600 people on the Appalachian Trail. And they have a 60-unit affordable housing community they're interested in broadband. So let me just flip through some slides and actually show you some pictures of what we've done and show you some costing. Again, we are an internet provider. We operate in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. If you're interested in checking us out, there's our website. One of our service offerings is what we call managed Wi-Fi service. So we don't just put in equipment and leave. We actually put in the equipment and then we manage that service, repair, upgrades, and constant maintenance. And oftentimes this is an existing multi-dwelling unit. So these are existing communities, and we're going in after the fact and overlaying this broadband Wi-Fi. And some of the benefits are, this is a very affordable way of getting broadband to the residents. It's very easy to use. You can think of it like connecting to Wi-Fi at McDonald's or Starbucks or any other place you would be. And the coverage of Wi-Fi can be quite extensive as well across the community. So some of the benefits are what I have on the screen here. I don't mean to go through these in detail, but it just makes it really easy to connect anything. Even your Alexa device can connect to Wi-Fi. So TVs, you know, just about anything in the home. It's very simple. We do have the ability on a Wi-Fi network to put up a landing page, which means the community can have announcements to the residents like, hey, trash is being delayed from Tuesday to Wednesday this week, and things like that. Or it could be used as an advertisement, and a local business could potentially advertise. We have the ability to get data analytics, and it's really a turnkey platform that makes broadband available to everyone in the community. There's no qualification process. You don't have to fill out the forms to say you're SNAP qualified to get the free broadband. If you're in that community, you get free Wi-Fi. It's there. So some of the projects we've done, some metro and some non. One is in the city of Charlotte. We've done 15 different communities in Charlotte. This is over 2,000 units where everybody who lives at any of these apartments has free Wi-Fi. And to the right, you see a screenshot of the access page. So this is paid for from a grant from the city of Charlotte. It's called Access Charlotte. So they're prominently displayed, and users can log in with a Facebook account or email. There's terms and conditions, certain things they wanted to make sure that the residents complied with. Another example is the city of Goldsboro. This was initiated by a grant that the Housing Authority of the city of Goldsboro acquired. And we ended up doing 9 different apartment communities. Very similar to Charlotte. Everybody who lives in those communities has free public Wi-Fi in their home, just like you were at a hotel. They don't have to pay for it. They don't have equipment in their units. They just grab their phone, laptop, TV, and connect to Wi-Fi. Very simple. So how does this get paid for? It's probably your next question. So there's 3 different models that we've seen. And the first one here has been the most popular, and that's a single payer system. And it's usually a grant. The city of Charlotte had a grant. The Housing Authority for Goldsboro had a grant. And they fund it for 2 to 3 years. What we've seen is once we deploy the Wi-Fi and we feed the housing community with fiber, so they're getting gigabit fiber to the community, it results in a per unit per month price of between $8 and $15 a month. So if you compare that to what you would pay for a normal internet bill, it's drastically less. Even the plans that AT&T and Charter have for low income, I think are $15 to $20. And there's all kinds of stipulations, like you have to file your SNAP plan and everything else. So a public Wi-Fi model can get down into this price range. The second way of paying for something like this is actually have the end user pay for it. 2 different subsets of that. One is the $8 to $15 per unit can just be added to the rent. The second model is for the end users to actually pay for their own access to the Wi-Fi. Some of you may have been on vacation at various places, and you can get a Wi-Fi code for a week or for a daily pass or something like that. We have the ability to actually have user accounts on the public Wi-Fi, and then the users can pay for it themselves. And then the third option is we have the ability to inject ads on that splash page. And you see on the right is actually Hot Springs. They have a rotating series of advertisements in their downtown Wi-Fi. It's not housing oriented, but in the downtown, they wanted to run ads. So that's another way of paying for things. We do tend to do a lot of public-private partnerships. So when you're thinking about doing something like this, there's other organizations, including my colleagues here on the panel, that might be able to provide assistance. Crossroads is a nonprofit organization in Charlotte that we worked with in the Greer Heights community. You can also use these projects for workforce development. When we were doing Charlotte, we partnered with City Startup Labs for a job reentry program. These were people coming out of prison, and we trained them to be technicians, and then we put them to work at installing the Wi-Fi. So this not only was providing the Wi-Fi service, but it was also an opportunity to develop some skills and some people that needed work. We're currently involved with the library project that Christa sort of alluded to. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library is going into neighborhoods in West Charlotte that are single-family homes. So this isn't an apartment community where you could just put in a few Wi-Fi access points. This is like a whole neighborhood of single-family homes. And we're putting Wi-Fi access points on the electric poles throughout the neighborhood, the streetlight poles, and then making the Wi-Fi available to everyone. So it's a very large project that we just started. And here's an example of more job training as part of the library project. We've hired 4 people. These were not out of the prison system. These were just 4 people from the community that were looking for a step up, and we've trained them, and we have them at work putting together the system. And my last slide is just wanted to reinforce that our whole mission in providing this community Wi-Fi is to make sure that everybody has access to affordable internet. You just have to have it in today's society, as some of the other panelists have mentioned.
Thank you so much, Alan. Before we get to Ziggy, I did see 2 questions in the chat that I'd love for you to take a crack at. So that managed Wi-Fi, is there enough bandwidth in there for multiple users, the child Zooming, the parent working from home?
Absolutely. That's why we feed each community with fiber, gigabit fiber with 1,000 megabits upload and download. And the way that we engineer the sites is we look at a capacity per device, which is a little different way of thinking of it than capacity to the unit. We want every device to get at least 25 megabit speed. Your phone, your tablet, your TV, your Alexa. So everything has that amount of bandwidth, and that is plenty of bandwidth for everybody in the community to do all these things simultaneously.
Thank you. And there was a question, is community data, and I assume the questioner means personal data, collected, as kind of as part of managing the network?
No personal data is collected, correct. The data that we do collect is more of, well, are users even using the Wi-Fi system? Did anybody log on today? Have we spent all this money needlessly? What is the return on the investment? We can capture things like Facebook login or email login if you wanted to reach out to the resident and follow up with them, but we don't track where anybody goes on the internet. No.
Sure, thank you. That's helpful, and helpful to hear that collecting that ROI helps manage to a grant-funded project. But I'd love to turn it over now to Ziggy. Beyond philanthropic dollars from a place-based lender, or from City Hall in the case of Charlotte, being one viable path. The current COVID relief packages and the prospective infrastructure bill will greatly increase the funding available for capital projects and also for digital inclusion. And we've heard both mentioned today, the infrastructure deployment and then encouraging adoption at residential communities. So what do housing developers and their lenders and others in this space need to be thinking about now to help with a local broadband planning process that could allow for access to some of these public dollars?
Can you hear me? Hello, can anybody hear me?
Christa, you're muted, but Ziggy, we could hear you.
Thank you. I was making a joke that inevitably in a conversation about high-speed internet and quality connectivity, we face some bumps in the road. So Ziggy, hopefully you can try again, or we'll get back to you in just a second. Why don't I take a question to Myles, and Ziggy, please join us or flag us if you're reconnected. So we are understanding that one of the big issues with expanding broadband access is data availability. What sort of data do we need to make informed policy decisions? I imagine Ziggy was going to talk about the need for quality mapping in order to access some of these public broadband grant programs. Can you speak a little bit more, Myles, about quality data being part of the equation?
Yeah, absolutely. So because any broadband deployment project, Allen's or otherwise, needs to have some sort of viability associated with it, and that's regardless of the capital stack or whether it's grant funded or anything, private, public providers. Anybody needs to make a business case. With any business planning, a pretty basic concept is going to be who's providing that service and where are they providing that service, and who might you be in competition with. If you're going to go into an area where there's already somebody providing fantastic affordable service, obviously your business case is going to be affected by that. If not, if it's an area where people are clamoring for it, that's going to change things as well. So basically, who's doing what where is a really basic thing that anybody in the space is going to be looking at. And the most basic place that any entity is going to be trying to find that data is from the FCC. Now, FCC data is, it's pretty widely acknowledged to be lacking in some pretty fundamental ways, and those issues are endemic to the industry as a whole, and kind of hobble planning efforts across the country pretty regularly, and that's for a few different reasons, and actually a lot of historical things that I won't get to in sort of these couple minutes. But very basically, it looks at service at the census block level, especially in rural places. A census block can get to be pretty big pretty quickly. The people who are responsible for reporting who is and isn't served in a census block are the providers themselves. So you have a situation where incumbents are reporting what service they do or don't provide. And on the flip side of that, there is no systematic or rigorous method for fact checking that reporting. So you have the people reporting the service saying whether they do, and then no one is checking that. So we can all sort of guess where that goes and where it skews. And then the way it's set up is that within a census block that can, again, be very large, if one premise is served, then the provider can say that entire census block is served. So if you're going to look at a map of who is providing what where, you'll see a very large swath of land, and you'll see, okay, the people there have service, but it's not granular, and you don't know who actually within there has service. And then you also don't know whether or not you can sort of trust whether there's service there to begin with. So if we take that as the baseline from which everybody is doing their planning work, it's a pretty challenging situation. A lot of times it results in the onus for data gathering being shifted to the people doing the work, and that results in a lot of creative and frankly pretty inspiring data collection efforts. But you're starting from a really challenging place.
Well, thank you for that. And I did see a question in the chat about whether there are policy conversations, including broadband in LIHTC utility allowances. And so, you know, Paul and Riordan would love for you to take a crack at that. How are states incentivizing and or requiring broadband connectivity in their LIHTC qualified allocation plans or HUD from a federal level? And I mean, does it differ from state to state? Is there a database where we can see, you know, kind of where this is prioritized as a matter of policy? Riordan, if you want to start.
I trust Paul more to start on that one.
Yep. You know, here's what I would say is that, you know, like in the states that I work in, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama, we don't see much movement in terms of including utility, you know, broadband and utility allowances. But I think I really believe that this is the time and the opportunity to take advantage of what's taking place in so many different areas in terms of affordable housing. There is so much money coming down the pipeline for affordable housing. And I just think with the infrastructure bill, no matter how it gets passed, you're going to see a lot of dollars go into affordable housing. And it's the same thing with the American Rescue Plan Act that's taking place right now. And so what we're doing on all of our developments is just starting the questioning, why not include utility allowance? We also would like to see HUD. HUD has been very, very innovative in terms of creating opportunities for rent structurings that are increased. And so now I think it's the opportunity that HUD can provide, since they have so much money available for broadband in rural areas, that they can start saying that if a development is going to do substantial rehab or new construction and it's going to be converted to RAD, then there should be some kind of pilot program established so that those developers can then tap into those funds to help with building infrastructure as well as the apartment units that would include broadband. I just think the opportunity exists now to kind of push that envelope as much as we can.
Excellent, thank you. And I did see, I think that Ziggy has rejoined us, and so I'd love for you to dovetail off of what Paul just said and frame it up for housing developers. There's a lot of money coming down the pipe for capital projects, for digital inclusion. It feels like the right time to be advocating. What are your thoughts? Oh, we lost him again. Well, good. Well,
Christa, I can kind of continue what Paul was saying though on the federal level from the policies, which is that speaking of the money that's kind of coming in for this, one of the things I was looking at recently was the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is from the American Rescue Plan. So to just like put some more numbers behind those big bills, there was about $3.2 billion in that, and that's specifically targeted towards lower income households being able to afford broadband internet better. It's about a $50 a month subsidy. But the thing is that, obviously it doesn't help you if you don't have access to broadband already. So what's currently in the infrastructure bill, at least last time I checked, was $65 billion for broadband. So 14 billion of that is to turn the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program into a permanent program. And then there's about $42 billion for service improvements, which includes expansion, stuff like that. So so I just wanted to kind of provide some numbers for that, so that Paul's right. I mean, it's definitely, there's a lot of funding here. So it's really about connecting the dots and figuring out how we can serve the most households with this.
Yep, thank you. So, becoming an advocate or an educator of tenants about the emergency broadband benefit is an option. But Alan, help us contextualize it a bit more. So can developers lower the barriers for telecommunications companies to offer tenants high-speed broadband services by, for example, installing conduit during construction? What are some of the other sort of financial considerations that developers and their lenders might make that would factor into impacting quality, speed of service, and ultimately, affordability over the long term?
Sure. So if you have the opportunity to build from scratch, then certainly putting in conduit right away would be very helpful for all of us. In the examples that I showed you earlier, those were all existing locations. So we often had to run brand new conduit, brand new electrical lines to try to implement even the Wi-Fi. So the more you can do it up front, the better. I would also make a pitch for local internet choice, if you want to use those words. That I don't think that just because a resident is in a low-income housing community, they should be forced into using a particular provider. They should have a choice of who they use. And if there's a free or affordable Wi-Fi solution that is an alternative to getting cable service or an expensive AT&T service or one of the other providers, that it should be made available. And a developer could look at it as an amenity. Living in this community, you get this as an amenity. All tenants have the ability to get the free broadband.
Excellent. That was helpful. And Ziggy, if you caught some of that, I wonder if you can hear us and could layer in here about ways that developers can make connectivity attractive to providers.
I apologize. I'm doing audio only through a phone. I have Google Fiber and mesh wireless, and somehow I guess Google decided that I shouldn't participate in this actively. So I mean, we have seen really a changed landscape. The infusion of capital, in one sense, is a game changer, and in another sense is not. And this is not. We've had problems with getting broadband to multiple dwelling units for a long time, and lots of localities have offered and implemented innovative solutions for that, often with wireless, but sometimes with wireline as well. But what is new is sort of the expansiveness of it that changes some of the economics. So from a technical perspective, what it does, it allows us to pursue more robust architectures. It's really expensive to retrofit existing houses. It's not. If building wireline connectivity into and the architecture into new development is fractionally almost doesn't really make a difference. But from the perspective of retrofitting, it can be costly and disruptive. But a lot of the funding that has come to us now with capital projects and also ARPA funds it's sufficiently flexible and adopted definitions of unserved that allow that you can really run with it, and you can implement an infrastructure that then becomes flexible enough that you can put a rooftop antenna and get a really good broadband signal wirelessly, and then redistribute it through internal wiring if it's done right. And then it can, again, go out to wireless Wi-Fi or is in hallways, sort of more of a hotel style model, or individual access points within the dwelling units. There are lots of ways to do this, and you get that flexibility. Or you can bring a wireline connectivity in, and here again, there's funding. So it's a whole solution kind of approach. And that means that if you have costly, if it's costly to get from where there are existing providers to the building, and that could be on a pole across the street, and you'd have to do underground, and that again could be expensive, but that sort of complex drop that may even go over some private third-party territory, land that has to be granted easement, all that can be covered, and so there's more opportunities. What I would say is that ideally you would want to put something in place that's open access and can accommodate different solutions and is flexible in terms of provider models. If we can encourage competition, that will be a great thing. Previous funding, because of the lack of a lot of funding resources, were constrained. You have to make compromises somewhere, and that's what has changed. And if there's one thing I would encourage developers to do, is to really be in close contact. And Alan is being close contact with the city, the county. They may already have programs in place. They would be delighted to work with you in most cases and do joint applications. They often have access, as capital projects funds, for example, will go through the state and will likely, depending on which state and how they engineer it, will likely be project by project in a given state, and it's a local government that would likely be the sub-grantee. So you have to work typically with a government partner. So that's really a primary access point that I would encourage right away. Work with your provider. I would also say that there's some implications in what you adopt as your strategy. If you're going to do a free model, like a come in and offer free Wi-Fi to everybody, it does give you some constraints later if you want to have participation in the emergency broadband benefit program, for example. So federal discount programs, discount doesn't of $50 off an existing bill of $0 doesn't compute, right? So you're not getting cost recovery in that way. So models where there are paid subscription, and this could be done with a private partner or a public partner, paid subscription, but the city or authority kicks in some funding to cover it or through a grant, and then opens up the possibility of getting some of that covered in return with federal funding if it's sort of designed right. Those are some things to certainly keep in mind. You can bridge the infrastructure piece with the subscription piece.
Thank you. And I'd love to give the rest of the panel a chance to comment on that, but in hopes of not losing you again, Ziggy, I wondered if you could speak quickly to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and in the next couple of days, they'll continue to collect comments that will refresh the record on improving competitive broadband access to multiple tenant environments, which I think as your comments reveal is their acknowledgement of some of the complexities of choice here. So would you mind speaking a little bit to what the FCC is deliberating on right now and perhaps direct the audience to have a look at that docket?
Yeah, sure. The most interesting thing to me is their choice of word, refresh. And it's really sort of messaging in many ways. It's the FCC, and if you read the last sentence, they sort of make that clear. They are releasing this proposed rulemaking that doesn't really have any proposed rules except a bunch of questions for comment as a way to reestablish its regulatory authority and jurisdiction. They're basically saying, you know, we're back, we're the cops in town, and we are willing to implement rules, regulations, propose laws that will sort of get this Wild West organized to actually benefit tenants. And so in general, they're restating in some ways what their goal is. They want to make sure that there aren't arrangements between the owner and the provider that are exclusive, that the arrangements lead to decreased competition, raise prices, limit tenant choice, or decrease service performance. Those are kind of the four metrics that they don't call them metrics, but this is really what they're looking at. And they go over a few of the main arrangements that are in place today: revenue share, exclusive wiring arrangements, and exclusive marketing arrangements. And they're just seeking comments at this point. In my opinion, they're really looking to get kind of the legitimacy and the backing to put some robust rulemaking in place. So that's definitely something to look out for. And if you have thoughts on how to increase competition, lower prices, increase tenant choice, and improve service performance within the context of arrangements between owners and building owners and providers, I think that would obviously be very good to submit before the window closes.
Well, that might be an invitation to the rest of our panel and even the audience. What say you?
Yeah.
Alan?
I'll quickly mention that we are working with a county in North Carolina that's going to use ARPA funds to basically roll out broadband in lower income sections of the county. So that's an opportunity. And just piggybacking a little bit on what Ziggy just said, each of our Wi-Fi implementations that I went over earlier are non-exclusive. The people in those units can still sign up for cable. They can still sign up with another provider. This is just something that is available to everyone.
Thank you. So, Paul, please.
Yeah, Christa, I would just like to say this in regarding public policy and state agencies, housing finance agencies. you know, I learned very early on that developers really just follow the State Housing Finance Agency. They do try to impact policy a lot, but if QAP, a qualified allocation plan, comes out and says, hey, we want to target an area that wants to increase broadband in a rural area, and we'll give you incentives, points, and things like that. And if the dollars are available out there, then that's a perfect marriage. And developers will, unfortunately, if the state agencies told every developer to dress up in a Pink Panther suit to get an extra point, they would dress up in a Pink Panther suit to get an extra point. So the point that I'm making is that developers literally follow the qualified allocation plan. So I would be advocating for everyone to start talking to the state housing finance agencies in terms of, going to their QA qualified allocation plans sessions, open sessions, where they take public comments to start having those conversations on that level. And then at the same level on HUD, anytime you close a HUD-RAD deal or anything like that, it's always an opportunity to interact with HUD. And so I think those are the times that we can start talking to the HUD folks about how to get this down to the rural areas. I think it was Myles's, or Riordan's kind of like mapping showing that in the southwest part of Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, you really don't have a lot of broadband connectivity. And so those are the areas that a lot of housing authorities are located. So anyway.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts and observations. And since we have just a few minutes left, one thing that we didn't touch on, and I'd really love the full panel's perspective on this, is that downstream application or adoption, the digital skilling, the resource rooms that might have devices available. What suggestions would you offer to property managers in thinking about their role in sort of digital inclusion once connectivity is available?
But it's a perfect time to work with another organization and partner with them to work on digital inclusion. In Charlotte, for example, there's a digital navigator program, which Queen's University has run in partnership with the city of Charlotte. So there is a navigator that can answer people's questions about the internet in general and what does this mean? What is HTTPS versus non-S? What is a VPN? What does it mean when this comes up on my screen? So all those types of questions are going to happen. So if you partner with another organization that has some resources in place, like a digital navigator function, that can really help out your residents.
Riordan, I wonder if you'd add to that. Your data is showing that adoption is perhaps in some places as much an issue as access. So is there a role for residential housing communities to sort of think collaboratively about supporting adoption, digital upskilling, et cetera?
Definitely. I think the big partner to work with in a lot of these ways is schools and libraries in terms of like delivering devices and then getting help with those devices. One of the things that I've analyzed is households with school-age children and how many of them have broadband versus households without. And households with school-age children are actually more likely to have broadband, I think, just out of necessity, because especially with this last year, but even before then, it was a real necessity to have that. And, there was a Pew Research report that came out, and they do a lot of good work on this type of thing, that showed basically about 2/3 of lower-income parents at the beginning of the pandemic were predicting that their kids would have a lot of trouble because of device availability. But my research finds that only 1/3 of lower income parents don't have high-speed internet. So that leaves like 1/3 of those parents who potentially, this is mixing data sources, but potentially have high-speed internet, but their kids are going to have trouble, accessing it during school. And, anyone who has school-age kids or, is connected to teachers or whatever knows that last year was kind of a nightmare, even when the internet was there, in terms of device availability and then device troubleshooting and getting onto the network and everything like that. So I think really partnering with the community resources, and there's also federal funding coming into some of those community resources like libraries and schools to expand internet access. So there's also funding coming in on that side to help with that.
Yeah, good point raised there. The Emergency Connectivity Fund to anchor institutions like libraries. Ziggy, did you have more thoughts?
Yeah, so I wasn't, I was in the wilderness for a little bit, so you may already have talked about it, but I just wanted to underscore the need for more data We obviously have neighborhood size census, block, school district size data on poverty, SNAP participation, et cetera. But we need to understand better where the gaps are in connectivity, and where exactly they are. Is it getting into the building? What's the drops? Even where are the multiple dwelling units, and how many in those are at risk? Capital projects funds will allow funding at a community basis, and you can define community in all kinds of different ways. So if the community is at risk, that they would love for you to invest there, and that could be part of your justification. So average household size and composition is also great data to have to really understand what the needs are in those places. So part of it is available, and part of it would have to be collected. And if there are nonprofits and or local governments that would take this on, I think that would add a lot. But in many cases where we are operating without data.
Yeah, thank you. So hearing some good closing thoughts here, and some themes that have surfaced about collaboration and sort of organizing stakeholder coalitions that include local governments, that include nonprofit organizations. But I think it's fair to say that housing will continue to play a key role in eliminating the digital divide. Any additional final thoughts? We have about 2 minutes left before we hand it back over to David.
Perhaps one thing to briefly keep in mind, sort of both at the housing or particular property level all the way up to the policy level, is that it's not a static issue, and what's adequate today won't necessarily be adequate tomorrow. Different data sources say different things, but generally acknowledged around 26% increased demand every year in bandwidth. So when you start getting out to 5 or 10 years, that's a pretty different speed threshold than you were looking at 5 or 10 years before. So I guess keeping in mind that different technologies can handle that in different ways, and especially when you're looking at it from the construction and infrastructure planning side, and sort of keeping these needs for the future in mind, because the need is not going away and the demand will continue to increase.
Well said.
Thank you, Christa.
Yeah.
That was great. And thank you everybody for participating. That was really informative. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has as well. I want to especially thank Brittany Webb from our team for doing so much work to put this together, and Henry Weiss and our Policy and Research Director, Luke Villalobos. I also want to thank JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Rocket Mortgage for your generous support. And I hope that all of you will visit our website at nhc.org, and appreciate all of our attendees who were able to join us today, and all of the others who were able to see us on YouTube when we post this on our YouTube page first thing tomorrow morning. So we appreciate all of your participation, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.